Happy feast day. You ever think to yourself that when you are at a rather sumptuous meal, that someone lays before you and someone says, "Wow, what a feast"? We think about that word usually only in relative relation to food. But of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with food. On the contrary, the word, of course, itself is referring to a religious celebration. And because we are Catholic, we finish our religious celebrations and we move into the next line of celebrations, a notch lower, which is food. For which Father Winslow kindly went out and got us a bunch of delectables when the Holy Mass is over today. And that's just right and good and Catholic and happy. Because this is our patronal feast, St. Thomas. Now naturally, as you can figure out, the parish was named St. Thomas specifically because it is a university parish. And it is a parish that serves, in particular, that community. And Thomas, of course, being the patron of universities, Catholic schools, etc. But to know Thomas the man, and therefore to know something about what intercessory powers he might be given for us in this parish, it's a little bit important to understand what made Thomas St. Thomas. And that, of course, is because he followed another saint called St. Dominic. Whenever God raises up a saint, he does so because he wants a particular grace to come into the world, which at that point is scarcely found. Using a human instrument to give to us, to his church, that which we desperately need. And there was a man named St. Dominic, a Spaniard, who was sent in particular by God to preach. Now you say, well, what is that so odd? Why is that great? We have plenty of preaching going on in this parish. Why is that a particular grace? Because you can imagine in the Middle Ages, bishops who were both the heads of their churches, but also heads of state. There wasn't a lot of preaching going on. You imagine priests in outlying areas before the reform of seminaries. There wasn't a lot of education amongst the clergy. Oftentimes it was the case that there was no one preaching. To this day in Italy, I remember when I was first there, I was studying Italian, and I was a week into my studies of Italian. And I noticed on the door of the chapel where I offered Mass every morning that they said, tomorrow there is a Holy Mass and a homily. I thought, is that worthy of an announcement? Because they don't preach during daily Mass. Now, there are times in this parish you might wish that the priests weren't preaching. But it was not that common, and that tradition is still there to some degree today. So much so that St. Dominic, to combat a particular heresy that was a massive cancer in the church, he was sent to go preach to them. But to preach to them meant that he needed two things. One, he needed to be educated. He had to know the faith. And second, he needed to be intimate with our blessed Lord. Because it's not enough to be smart, and it's not enough to be educated. To know Christ Jesus, one needs sapiencia. That was the very first word in the opening antiphon. We need wisdom, which is a grace by which God shares experiential knowledge of himself. So that I can know him not just by what I read, as important as that is, but I know him as the Book of Wisdom itself says, those who have wisdom become what? The friends of God. Why did Thomas go after this order of preachers, now known as the Dominicans? Whenever a young man or a young woman responds to a vocation, the vocation is planted in him as a graced desire. He experiences in himself a desire that doesn't come from himself, but is, as it were, stirred up inside of him. And he finds delight at the thought of making a holocaust of his life in a particular manner. Thomas was educated by the Benedictines. Thomas was supposed to become the abbot of Monte Cassino. Thomas was further educated in Naples by the Benedictines. And then he sees these men in black and white, not tied to a monastery, but itinerant preachers. What does that stir up in St. Thomas? I have no idea, because he never told me. He never told anyone. But if I were to guess, a sense of adventure. From a little boy, he asked the question, what is God? To couple the education that he had and would further have with a towering intellect, the likes of which the world has scarcely seen, with the thought of living a life that is so much like the life of the one who reveals who God is, that is to say, Jesus Christ. For what was Christ in his 3 years of public ministry but an itinerant preacher? In some sense, he was the original Dominican. And so Thomas himself, donning the habit of those dogs of the Lord, those Dominicans, sets out on an adventure to do what? First, to intimately pray. As he said himself, I have learned more at the foot of the cross than I have learned from anything I have ever read. This is a man who read everything there was to read, and who said that the greatest grace that he had received was that he never read anything he didn't understand. I can barely get through the morning paper without coming across something that I don't understand. I don't actually read the morning paper. But an intimate life with our blessed Lord, cultivated by what? Cultivated by silence. The Dominican motto is Silentium Pater Predicatorum. Silence is the father of preaching. So what happens is, as the Dominicans say, you pull back the bow. You first pray. You enter into that white-hot silence. You learn to know him. You grapple with him. You desire to have all your passions inflamed with the delight of knowing God alone and speaking to him alone. It was said of St. Dominic himself that he never, ever spoke anything except about God. Can you imagine? It says that he spoke to God or about God. That was it. Coming out of that white-hot silence. And then those hours and hours and hours of study that is not an academic exercise, but is, as it were, looking through the folios of Revelation, learning all the contours of it, to know who and what God is. All of that is pulling back the bow until you find that soul or souls to whom you're going to release the arrow of preaching. That's a Dominican life. That was the life of St. Thomas. A life that so culminated in perfection, both in intellectual writings, in being the light of the magisterium and the angelic doctor, but more importantly, a friend of Christ's. So much so that at the end of his life, he stopped speaking. He only spoke then with the Word himself, and the Word came and took him home.